People who knew Earl Hutchins before would tell you the same thing without hesitation. The man was steady, solid as the oak tree in his front yard that he'd watched grow from a sapling over 40 years. He'd spent 32 years driving long-haul trucks across highways most people only fly over, came home every time with his paycheck intact and his priorities clear. Family first, everything else after. He was 74 now, and the road had been kind enough to leave him his health. Mostly. Type 2 diabetes had found him in his late 60s, the way it finds a lot of men who spent decades eating whatever was available at highway rest stops and truck stop diners. It was manageable. He managed it. Insulin in the morning, watch what he ate, check his levels, keep moving. He didn't complain. Complaining wasn't something Earl Hutchins had much practice with. Then Marcus came to live with him. Marcus was 11 years old, and Earl's grandson through his daughter Renee, who had loved that boy with everything she had right up until the car accident on a rain-slick Tuesday evening that took her away from both of them. Renee's ex, Marcus's father, had been out of the picture for years. Last known address somewhere in Nevada. Unreachable in the way that certain men make themselves deliberately unreachable when responsibility comes looking for them. So Marcus came to Earl. There was no discussion, no deliberation. The boy had nowhere else to go, and Earl was his grandfather. That was the whole equation. See, what Earl hadn't known, what no one had thought to tell him in the fog of grief and paperwork and emergency guardianship filings, was that Marcus had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 8 months before his mother died. Not the manageable kind Earl had. The kind that required careful, consistent insulin dosing every single day, or the consequences became life-threatening with frightening speed. Earl sat in the pediatric endocrinologist's office 3 weeks after Marcus moved in and listened to the doctor explain the medication regimen. He nodded along, asked the right questions, took the printed instructions home and read them 4 times. Then he sat at his kitchen table with both prescriptions in front of him and did the math. His insulin, with his Medicare coverage, ran him about $180 a month. Manageable on his fixed income if he was careful everywhere else. Marcus's insulin, a different formulation, the kind required for type 1 management, not covered the same way under the emergency Medicaid that was still being processed for the boy, was $340 a month out of pocket until the coverage came through. The caseworker had said it could take 6 to 8 weeks to finalize. Earl's monthly income after rent was $610. He stared at those numbers for a long time. Then he folded both prescriptions carefully, put them in his shirt pocket, and drove to the pharmacy. He filled Marcus's prescription. He did not fill his own. He told himself it was temporary. 6 to 8 weeks, the caseworker had said. He could stretch what he had left from last month. He could be careful with his diet, more careful than usual, or compensate with food choices and portion control. He'd read about people managing blood sugar without insulin. He knew it wasn't ideal. He told himself it was temporary. He did not tell Marcus. Marcus was already carrying more than any 11-year-old should have to carry. He'd lost his mother. He was sleeping in a strange bedroom in his grandfather's house, trying to remember which drawer the silverware was in, trying to figure out how to exist in a life that had been completely rearranged without his permission. The last thing that boy needed was one more thing to worry about. So Earl smiled at breakfast. He checked Marcus's levels before school, with the same steady hands that had steered 18-wheelers through mountain passes in February. He packed the boy's lunch bag with the snacks the doctor had recommended and wrote little notes on the napkins, the kind Renee used to write, because he'd seen her do it once and thought it was a good idea, even though it wasn't something men of his generation had been raised to do. "You've got this, bud," Grandpa Earl. What Marcus didn't see was his grandfather's glucose monitor telling a different story every morning. Earl's levels were climbing without consistent insulin. He felt it. The thirst, the fatigue, the fog that settled over his thinking by mid-afternoon. He drank more water. He cut out everything that wasn't absolutely necessary from his diet. He went to bed earlier because exhaustion hit him harder now. He told himself 6 to 8 weeks. Week 4 was when Margaret noticed. Wee Margaret Osey lived next door and had been bringing Earl a covered dish every Sunday since his wife Patricia had passed 6 years ago. It was a habit that had started as condolence and become friendship. She was 68, recently retired from nursing, and she had eyes that had spent 4 decades noticing things people tried to hide. She noticed the way Earl moved when he came to the door that Sunday. Slower than usual. A slight unsteadiness she hadn't seen before. The grey tinge to his skin that she recognised from years of sitting beside patients' beds. She set the dish on his kitchen counter and asked him directly how he was doing. Earl said fine. Margaret sat down at his kitchen table and asked him again. He was quiet for a moment, then he told her. Not everything at once. It came out in pieces. Shine the way things do when someone has been holding them alone for too long. The 2 prescriptions. The math that didn't work. The decision he'd made. The weeks he'd been going without. Margaret was quiet for a long moment after he finished. Then she asked to see his glucose readings from the past 4 weeks. Earl handed her the monitor. She scrolled through the numbers without expression, the way nurses do when they need to think clearly, and emotion would only get in the way. When she looked up, her voice was careful and even. "Earl," she said, "you are not managing, you are surviving, and barely." He started to say something about it being temporary, about the Medicaid processing, about 6 to 8 weeks. She held up one hand. "How long has it been?" 4 weeks. "And how are you feeling, honestly?" He looked at the table. "Tired," he said. "Real tired." Margaret made 3 phone calls from Earl's kitchen that afternoon, right in front of him, so he couldn't politely decline. The first was to a patient assistance program run through the insulin manufacturer that she'd referred patients to during her working years, a program that provided free or deeply reduced medication to qualifying individuals regardless of insurance status. The second was to the county's Area Agency on Aging, which had an emergency prescription assistance fund that most people didn't know existed. The third was to the caseworker handling Marcus's Medicaid application to flag the case as medically urgent and request expedited processing. By Tuesday, Earl had a callback. By Thursday, he had a month's supply of his insulin at no cost, true with a bridge program in place while the longer-term assistance was arranged. Marcus's Medicaid was expedited and finalised within 10 days, rather than the remaining weeks they'd been told to expect. Earl didn't make a big announcement about any of it. He just started feeling better, gradually the way you do when your body gets what it actually needs. The fog lifted. The fatigue eased. He stood a little straighter. Marcus noticed that his grandfather seemed more like himself, and said so one evening at dinner, matter-of-factly, the way kids sometimes see things clearly, precisely because they don't know they're not supposed to. "You seem better, Grandpa." Earl looked at the boy across the table. Renee's eyes in a younger face. His family, what was left of it, and what was worth everything. "I am better, Bud," he said. He didn't explain further. Marcus nodded and went back to his dinner. After the dishes were done, and Marcus was at the table doing homework, Earl went out to the front porch and sat in the chair he'd sat in for 40 years and looked at the oak tree in the yard. He thought about Renee. He thought about Patricia. He thought about 32 years of long roads and coming home, and the strange, unexpected shape a life can take in its final chapters. Then he went back inside to check Marcus's levels before bed, wrote the next morning's napkin note while the boy slept, and turned off the kitchen light. Steady, solid, still.